New Zealand, 1971. Not exactly a stellar year in the country's history. Rip snorting period, full stop. It was the year Tiwai Point aluminium smelter opened in the deep south. Q Manapori Power Station. New Zealand Rail still had steam locomotives servicing the main track line between Christchurch and Dunedin in the South Island. The top three selling recording artists of 71 were led by the local boy Craig Scott, followed by Paul McCarthy and Wings, then Tony Orlando and Dawn. Drab is one term befitting the country at the time. Arguably the most significant historic event of that year, over those 12 months, was the opening of New Zealand's first KFC. There was, however, one other event, though, that went straight over the locals' heads, went front page elsewhere, spawned a new word, still in use. 9,000 kilometres north. It all starts in the port of Lyttelton, 5 kilometres as the seagull flies from Christchurch. Lyttelton is now New Zealand's second biggest port. Not when this story happened. In keeping with the lay of the land in the introduction, it wouldn't be till 1975 Lyttelton would receive its first container crane. Down south at Port Chalmers in Dunedin, they got two. That's not to say it wasn't busy. It was. Before containerisation, it took 5 ships to carry the load of one. Meaning a nationality would drink and brawl in one of the local Lyttelton pubs. The Canterbury, the Mitre, the Royal and the British. Norwegians, Spanish, Ecuadorians, I think the yellow bendy fruit, South Koreans, Danes, Americans, Russians, Dutch. It was a true United Nations. Not to forget, the stars of this show, the Japanese. The largest contingents of vessels moored to the Lyttelton wharfs were Japanese. In a single year, 300 Japanese fishing boats would fish around New Zealand waters, providore at ports up and down the country. These fishing vessels chased mackerel, tuna and squid, regardless of the catch. They were commonly all referred to as squid boats. This wasn't the only trade coming and going between Japan and Lyttelton. Roll-on, roll-off vessels loaded with cars and trucks, more conventional vessels with steel and chemicals. Then there was also icebreakers and research vessels going north. There was the vessels carrying meat, fish and logs. Compared to many of the other crews, the Japanese sailors had a reputation for honesty and keeping out of trouble. Well, most of the time. 71 didn't get off to a good start for Team Japan. There was the mass brawl at the British Hotel involving 20 Japanese sailors and an unprescribed number of Yugoslavs that couldn't be subdued by the local Lyttelton police and needed backup in the form of the dog squad to come through the tunnel from Christchurch and intervene. Then the Japanese fishing fleet would further test the locals' hospitality. When it was found, the crew of the Asahi Maru No. 2 had a blue penguin as a pet. They'd tied a piece of rope around one of the animal's legs and for entertainment threw it over the side of the boat in port, letting it attempt to swim away to safety before dragging it unceremoniously back on board. The public and authorities were not amused. The Asahi Maru No. 2 was made to go out to sea and release the poor creature. There were also another couple of other reasons why things were turning sour, not just confined to the Japanese, I must add. The Russians and South Koreans were the two main villains on the first score, that being overfishing. There were increasing industry calls to limit the catch sizes, issues with foreign vessels also taking undersized fish and using illegal nets, more illegal activities like fishing inside New Zealand's exclusive 75-mile fishing zone. Political pressure was mounting to increase it to 200 miles that it is today. All the squid boats were guilty by association. And some more bad publicity came in the form of the largest inhabitants of the oceans, whales. Few people outside Japan liked the practice of eating them. This is the backdrop as one of those 24 Japanese fishing vessels that was using Littleton at the time left on the long journey back home, 28th of April 1971. The 250-ton Kompira Maru 28. The real story now unfolds. It's midday, the 28th of April 1971. The weather is fine and there's just a moderate swell. The Kompira Maru 28 is 24 miles off the coast of the South Island of New Zealand, heading north. The crew are looking forward to finally getting back to home base, Umibōzu. The 26-man crew, having been away now for 6 months. At the wheel is Captain Kimura. Those of you familiar with judo may recognise that surname. Anyway, the vessel is undertaking some last-minute fishing when something strange appeared 200 metres off starboard, right side to you and me. A large creature with 2 bulbous red eyes, and those were just the ones on top. Below were what looked like 2 smaller ones, shut or half closed at best, staring inquisitively at the vessel. This was like nothing the hardened and experienced crew had ever seen. Fishing immediately came to a halt. The whole crew stood on the deck transfixed, mystified. With just a couple of metres of the creature's head and body above the surface, conceivably, it's possible this animal could be 10 or more metres in length, close to half the length of their vessel. Imaginations quickly turned to the Umibōzu, the large darkened humanoid water-dwelling creature from Japanese folklore. What they could currently see off the side of the vessel certainly filled many of those criteria. Childhood nightmares. For anyone that has seen Star Wars 1, that's 99% of humanity, imagine the head and texture of the character Jabba the Hutt, and you're pretty much on the money. The closest non-fictional animal Captain Kimura could equate this to was a hippopotamus, Kaba in Japanese. He immediately dubbed the creature
Kabagon.
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 This unique name stuck, entered Japanese lexicon. Thinking on his feet, Captain Kimura issued the orders.
なんと浮いているカバだ。急いで網を張ってください。生き物を捕まえてみましょう。ではもう私たちも信じないだろう。無理を出してください。急いで。
Words to the effect, WTF, it's a floating hippo. Hurry, get the nets up. Let's capture the creature. No one will believe us. Get the harpooner. Hurry. When I said capture, it wasn't to be hauled aboard alive. Get a mental picture now of a whaling vessel in full technicolor. You'll get the gist. Gathering in the nets takes time. Getting a harpoon armed takes time. Mr. or Mrs. Kabagon wasn't hanging around to be shish kebabbed, become lot 104 at the famous Tokyo Sea Serpent market. It was off, never to be seen again. Well, not technically true. You'll find out there is a sting at the end of the story. The Kompira Maru had missed out on the biggest catch of their lives, empty-handed. One of the biggest catches in marine history, possibly. When they told head office, the odd wife, after all, it wasn't every day an Umibōzu appears outside a manga magazine. Well, at least, not since the cell phone camera was invented. A reporter from their local newspaper had the inside scoop, was on the first plane to New Zealand, hired a helicopter to drop him off to the vessel, but by then they were halfway up the east coast of the North Island, well away from the place it was sighted. He did get a chance to secure the captain's passable drawing rendition of what the crew and him saw, and that's it in the thumbnail. When the crew finally arrived back in Yaesu, it was the middle of July. They still found themselves the focus of a media scrum, minor celebrities. Interest was still high. What about the rest of the world? How much buy-in was there in Kabagon home waters? New Zealand? Bugger all. Better known for stories on the royals and celeb weddings, recipes. It was only the New Zealand Women's Weekly that published the story in depth. The daily newspapers treated the story coming off the telex from Japan with scorn, dedicated a few hundred measly words under the condescending headline, "For goodness sake." Even then, it was months later, Kiwi editors, likely very conscious, uttering fishing in the same paragraph as Japanese wasn't something that was going to sell newspapers. The mega story in New Zealand was fish and chip wrapping paper, El Pronto. What was or is a Kabagon? Apart from today's modern day iterations, a range of toys akin to Godzilla, which is a grand segue for me to one of Godzilla's numerous rivals, a baddie that has a striking resemblance to the Kabagon, the Hedorah, the red-eyed smog monster. The Hedorah is more oozy than, say, a Jabba. He arrived from outer space and evolved from a tadpole-like creature, growing to a giant slime ball, able to challenge Godzilla by consuming all the yummy pollution humans had conveniently left about, besides a plate with milk for the hedgehog. When did the mutant monster Hedorah first get to blows with Godzilla? That movie came out in 1971. And to my mind, this is one possible line of thinking. Then we have to look at aquatic creatures we know to exist outside of myths and B-grade movies that meet the criteria described, can live in seas of this temperature, and got perhaps well off the beaten current. Elephant seal, jutting their heads above water, is my first pick. Their northern boundary is normally about 200 kilometres south of the South Island. Distance to this location in question here is 700 kilometres, give or take. Elephant seals are massive creatures. Behemoths, 4,000 kilos and 5 to 7 metres. They can also travel 100 kilometres a day. Those are my two pokes in the dark. Let me know what you think, possible explanations. And before you scoff at this story, treat it with disdain, get possible egg on your face, like the New Zealand media would do 6 years later. This wasn't the only time the Japanese media would be beating a path to New Zealand after reports emanating from Japanese trawlers of sea serpents. Only in 1977, they now had photos, plus something way, way better, a body. This was one story that would go global. Subscribe and you'll get to hear that bite-sized story shortly. If you're wanting to know where to also listen to this podcast, Google Weird NZ, Weird, E-N-Z-E-D. Different options would appear on the back of Buzzsprout. Spotify is one. If you are listening to this podcast and viewing it on YouTube, wondering where Interesting Things fits in, Weird NZ is a sister podcast to Interesting Things. I will spot you next time when I'll introduce another weird and quirky story from New Zealand. Bye for now.